Breaking the Cycle. My name is Alan Hyde, and tonight we have a very special guest with us, licensed mental health counselor, Amaka Agulué.
Yep, you got it.
Nailed it. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, good. So they're going to get to know you tonight. I've been getting to know you kind of offline before our conversation here, but could you tell us just a little bit, Amaka, what got you into the field of mental health and what drew you to be of service to your community?
Yeah, sure. Generally, I think of the mental health field as a calling anyway. To do this work, you really have to be inspired to help and support in any way you can. In my experience, that's why anybody gets into this field. And a lot of times I really think about this question for myself, and it comes down to how can I be of service to my community or to the world in a way that allows people to heal? Because I notice there's a lot of healing needed, right? There's a lot of support that's needed. So that was my calling. That was my inspiration. How can I be of help? How can I be of support? And here's a whole field that does that.
Yeah.
So I started leaning in.
Was this the passion from the beginning when you started going to school, like in your undergrad too, or was it a growing passion?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting because when I first started undergrad, I really struggled to see what what I was interested in. And then I took a psychology 101 class, and it's psychology 101. So a lot of people are just like dismissive of it, but I was really excited about it, and I was fully enthralled by all the content. So I thought about, okay, this might be something to look further into.
Yeah.
And so I did. I actually got my minor was in psychology, but it took me a while to realize that this field was something that I wanted to do.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you work with a lot of trauma-informed type of work and with clients kind of with long-term trauma histories. I noticed kind of that generational piece too, and that's something on this channel we're always interested in. And I'm curious just kind of the approaches that you take in that, and kind of what you're seeing people these days come in to seek your services and to seek your support in that service that you're offering.
Yeah, generational trauma is very interesting because it encompasses just, when you think about a child who grows up in any family, there's a generational component to that. And in the way their caregivers support or don't support them can be traumatic, right? If we're not necessarily attuned to that child's emotional experience, that may impact them in ways that we only see later on.
Yeah. Do you find that there's a lot of willingness these days for people to look at like childhood experiences, or do you still see, because I know when I started like a decade ago, that was a growing movement and conversation, I think, like in general psychology, where the population was a little bit more willing to start talking about it, but it's taken some time. Do you see people like in your practice are more willing to be open to that and to explore that with you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because a lot of times it's not a direct, okay, let's look into your childhood and see what your parents did. A lot of people are really taken aback by that because they love their parents, and they don't see sometimes that their parenting wasn't the best. They say, they did the best they could, which is true. But what we can look at is, what are the things that you're struggling with now? And they tend to, on their own, tell a story about, oh, well, my parent, showed up in this way or did this thing. And it's great to come in that roundabout way, because it allows them to have more compassion and empathy for how their parent showed up in their lives, how they experienced their parent in times of stress, rather than it being a blaming situation or experience.
Yeah, I think that, you nail it, right? That's kind of one of the first barriers and defenses is like, don't attack my parents, don't blame them. And that's not our job at all. Our job is just to help you see what you kind of already knew in the ways of the imperfections that the family operates.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've been doing that for, you said, about 6 to 8 years in there. I mean, we factor in obviously the beginning with the education, and we were kind of joking about that before, but
Yeah.
about 6 to 8 years you've been practicing with this.
Yes, absolutely. So when I started, as with all clinicians, you're really just doing a lot of different interventions depending on the client. And what I found was we always end up in this space where we're talking a little bit about, this is what happened with my parents. This is how my parents experienced their parents, or this is how I am parenting my child. So I learned very quickly that that's a really big piece of how people cope or relate to others or experience trauma.
Yeah. Do you do a lot of like family tree work with your clients, or have you?
No, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's not about the family per se, it's about the person now. So we can acknowledge that there was trauma in the past, or there were things that happened that weren't so great, but we don't dwell on the past so much. We always bring the focus in the here and now, the present moment, to see, okay, what is working and where can we go from now, knowing that this was the history, knowing that this happened. But again, it's not necessarily about blame. Not that the family tree brings up blame, but it just sort
Yeah.
of harps on the things that we can't change.
Sure. Well, and I like that too, because the whole purpose of, as we bring clinicians week after week on here, is to see the different approaches. And I think for those listening, because we'll get the questions week to week of like, hey, where do we find this information? And I loved what they had to say. And it's like, we've had clinicians where that is their background. They'll go really into the family lineage, but there are clinicians where it's like, just as effective, we're focusing on the here and now, your adult experience, and how to feel and be better.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason that I found it's more beneficial for me as an approach to go that way is because it provides a lot of hope for what's possible currently. Once we start delving into the past, it can get overwhelming sometimes to think about, or to sort of peel back the layers of all the things and all the nuances of how trauma has shown up. There can be so much, and it can be overwhelming in a way that that person may have to take a lot of time to process that before coming to the present and focusing on what can be done moving forward.
Yeah. And do you work with mostly females or males, or is it kind of split for you?
Definitely split.
Yeah. Yeah. And what would you say, just kind of, if someone was going to come to see you or stumble on your website, what could they expect, just kind of from your work and your approach with people, and the way that you're going to just kind of onboard them into Amaka's world and get to know you?
Yeah, so I focus a lot on the integration of mind, body, and spirit.
I saw that.
Yeah, that's a huge piece for me, because when I think about the spiritual aspect, not religious per se, but the spirit that houses, or the spirit within our body, right? That spirit is always there, and sometimes it takes some digging to get to know the authentic sort of look of it, the look and feel of it. And I think a lot of times it can be hard to uncover that yourself, because you are, just sort of going about the daily life and trying to keep your head above water. So in my sessions, I really like to create the space for us to bring the spirit to the forefront and think about, how do we nurture this aspect of ourselves so that we can actually tap into the innate wisdom, right, that's in all of us.
Yeah, it's why I've always liked the term higher power, especially in a clinical setting.
Yes.
And it's such a charged time around conversations like that. There's a lot of different I think there's a tendency for those things, at least on social media, to become political conversations, and it gets really charged. But what I really like about what you're saying is, it's that age-old foundation we have as clinicians. I'm going to meet you where you're at and help pull that out so that you can
Yes.
connect with your version of it that's going to
Exactly.
benefit you.
Absolutely. And that's a great way of putting it, because once you tap into that aspect, you can empower your client to connect with themselves and support themselves outside of therapy.
Yeah. And are you a part of a practice, or is it just your practice?
It's just my practice.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I was looking at your website, it was very apparent, the mind-body connection, and even in the bio that you sent over, but especially when you go on your website, every tab I was clicking on, I was like, okay, I see what you're talking about here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you because I know you said you're working virtually currently, but back in the day, would you integrate some of those experiences of like yoga and some of those mindfulness practices? Like, I guess it's like when I was an intern, we'd take clients on hikes and things like that. Did you do a lot of that kind of stuff in the beginning too?
Yeah, well, I was fortunate that in my training, I was able to do practicum at a site where they integrated gardening, there was yoga, gym, music, so many things. That this was at an inpatient outpatient facility called Skyland Trail, and they allowed people to really express themselves in different ways and find therapy and meaning through all of these different ways. And that really was aligned with my own sort of vision for what it means to heal, or what healing can look like, sort of this expansive view. And that gave me the courage to invite the spirit into my sessions as well.
And was that a like a mental health treatment center? Was it a substance use treatment center?
It was mental health, but coincidentally, I was the substance use group lead. So I worked a lot with substance use individuals, dual diagnosis, and we did talk about higher power a lot, and sort of, cultivating the spirit and bringing it along when you're healing or you're going on that journey that's very difficult.
Have you in your private practice, because I think we tend to end up in private practice working with clients who are a little bit more ready to kind of adjust to daily life and things like that versus when they're needing treatment. But have you run into at times in your career in private practice where you've had to recommend someone to go into treatment and then resume therapy with you afterwards? Has that come up for you before?
Yeah, so referring out is necessary, right? Sometimes I've never had anyone sort of go get treatment and come back, just because there are so many clinicians to choose from. But I definitely support individuals finding clinicians that are the best fit for them. And since I'm not necessarily a crisis clinician, or I'm not sort of focused on the sort of management and stabilization of issues, I always refer out for those.
And we've talked about this a few times on the show, but how do you normalize that for someone who may be like afraid, not just to seek therapy, but treatment, and when they're in that hard up spot? What do you say to people?
That it's normal to be apprehensive, to go into a space and be vulnerable, and you're not sure what's going to come up or what you're going to talk about. But I always encourage just giving it a try, and also keeping in mind that you can, this term may not be great, but shop around, right?
Sure.
For a clinician that fits, for you. Because really, we're space creators. We create the space to allow people to be themselves and to witness themselves as well.
I like that term, space creators.
Yeah.
It's very spiritual.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of, as I'm listening to you, I'm getting that vibe from you. I when I was looking at some of the things that you've done, you're very spiritual. I think just in the nature that you bring to things like this too. Like there was a gentleman you did a podcast with some time back, I saw on your social media, and it was very spiritual based. And it's nice to hear those things and just listen to and see all the different ways that people are creating that space.
Yeah. And I think in this current climate, a lot of people are sort of looking for something greater than themselves, looking for something more to lean into. And sometimes it is that looking within to see your inner resilience, your inner support, your inner wisdom, rather than sort of feeling like the answers are outside of yourself.
You think that, I'm sure there's a million factors here, but do you think that has a lot to do with like the pandemic too, and some of the times that we faced in the last couple of years, that just in our culture and society?
When you say has a lot to do,
With seeking something bigger, seeking bigger answers.
yes, absolutely. The feeling of uncertainty is huge for a lot of people. Feeling like there's no sense of control, or the chaotic experience of the pandemic, right, was really upsetting for a lot of people. When we talk about the new normal, right, it's major adjustments. A lot of people had to sort of come to terms for themselves. What are my values? What are the things that I find most important? What are the things that I would like to focus on? And usually, when we're faced with things like mortality, we do tend to look at, what do I want to do with my time or my life, in that sense. So that can be really daunting for a lot of people, but it's a general invitation to
Yeah.
look deeper within.
I like that. That's like that's an eternal optimist view
Mm-hmm.
on it, which I'm just getting the sense that jives well with you, the eternal optimist.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've been thinking, because this comes up quite often, of creating a segment on the show of like, where were you as a clinician when COVID hit? What were you up to? And were you already in private practice? Were you at a center?
I was working for a foundation. I was actually working through the pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was interesting at that time that we got the notification to sort of stay indoors and work from home. I was a supervisor for this was sort of a foster care transitional placement, and I was transporting a child to their mother, and they were asking me all of these questions about what was happening and what to expect, and I sort of had to give my 2 cents, even though I didn't fully know.
Yeah.
And it was from a perspective of we don't have all the answers of what's going on, but we're going to keep updated and get the information that we need. But right now, this is what we're doing, right? So bringing it back to the here and now, what can we do right now? And that was supportive for them, not to think about the big picture and what can't we control and the uncertainty of it all, but currently, what can we do and what's happening now?
Yeah, I remember there was this workbook, at least out in the circles where I was in California, for anxiety, that got real big because it was like pushed out by this group of clinicians as like a response for treatment centers, because everybody was such heightened anxiety. And like on the first list of like 5 things was stop watching the news.
Yeah,
Like
that's a big thing.
get outside of that bubble of like, here's the big old picture, and it's like there's nothing we can do about that.
Right.
Yeah.
And to your point, it just creates a lot of anxiety, right? We're getting information about all the things we can't control.
Yeah.
So it really takes us out of, okay, in my immediate environment, currently what is in front of me? And it, watching the news just makes us think of the whole wide world and what we're going to do about the whole wide world, which is daunting.
Yeah. Now with, you're speaking my language with the lack of control conversation, right? Because I work with 12-steppers, alcoholics. I work with the family members. So a lack of control is the basis of everyday conversations for me. But when you have a client come in and that's you're noticing, hey, maybe some of the distress is because of a lack of control. What are some of the things that you found are helpful and help your clients seek the success to maybe like let go? Because I know like with my clients, I have an easy out. I can say, hey, we need to get you in community, 12-step programs, right? But when someone isn't an addict, right, or a family member of one, as a clinician, and again, this is, you and I both know this could go on forever and ever of all the nuanced space creation that we make, but what would be just kind of the cliff notes of how you help someone navigate that?
Yeah, so getting down to values. What are your core values? Because I always think of core values as a compass, an internal navigation to help you see where it is you want to go. And so a lot of things outside of that purview tend to drop away once you sort of have a direct focus on that. And then, of course, cognitive distortions, right? Challenging limited beliefs, limited thinking patterns. That is always helpful for anyone, because when you do feel quote unquote out of control, or that you don't have control of things, you can come up with a lot of ideas as to why things suck, right? So,
Yeah.
so, getting very focused for yourself on, okay, what is actually most important to me, and what am I able to do about it? If my distortion tells me that I have to do something about it, or else I can challenge it and see, is that actually true? And do I actually have only, one direction to go, or are there multiple options?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you do a lot of that with like writing, or do you teach them that and kind of the conversational patterns like how you and I are doing right now, or both?
So it depends, right? Sometimes it can be difficult to sort of talk about things and then leave the therapy space and remember those things. So one primary thread with all of my clients is taking notes, and they love to do it because a lot of what we talk about resonates in a way that it changes perspective. So it's less about, okay, try doing this or do this. It's through the conversation, through talking, insights come up around sort of how to navigate those difficult situations.
Yeah. So you'll have them break out the notepad and start
Oh
taking
yeah,
it.
yeah, absolutely.
I have a few clients who do that, and naturally that's what they're inclined to, and they have a lot of success with that, and I've got a lot of respect for that in the process too. Of like, here was this aha moment, and I really do, before we move on, want to make sure I capture this, and it's like, yeah, that's the work right there.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's so powerful because, when we think about, going back to trauma and being impacted by certain thoughts or experiences, a lot of times you may forget, right? Your neural pathways only sort of in the fight or flight mode focus on the things that are maybe sort of glaring in your face, and you forget about the nuances. So in a moment in your daily life, you may forget about, oh, we actually talked about there's something that I can try to do here to break this pattern. But when you take notes, it reinforces those ideas for yourself, and it's less about, okay, I'm just going to talk about it and then leave it there. It's, I'm going to talk about it, write it down, and then it comes up and I reflect on it.
Yeah, there's something really powerful about learning who you are as a human being when that pen hits the paper in black and white. And you're confronted by it, but oftentimes you're confronted in the way of acceptance because you're the one who wrote it. And there's a lot of power to that.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what, it's all about, empowerment, right? Coming to the understanding that I can look at myself and see what it is I need and get support to give myself those things.
Yeah. Self-parenting, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's interesting the way it ties into, because how we were talking a few minutes back of like, I think there's just a lot of noise in the world today around some of those kind of topics. And I see that a lot in my clinical practice where, you start to go down the road of teaching the fundamentals of empowerment. And the first kind of barrier, especially with younger clients, maybe you've seen this too, is like all of the memes and all the videos online and the ways it's like, oh, it's just this blind self-love. And it's like, no, it's actually much more beautiful than that. And oftentimes it's much dirtier of a process, and you're in the mud and you're figuring life out.
Yes, absolutely. And, I have a term that I like to use, self-devotion, which is kind of the end goal, right? When you are out of therapy and you are supporting yourself in between sort of therapy check-ins or check-ins with anybody, what's happening there? How are you being with yourself? And self-love is self-devotion, but it's essentially the understanding that I matter, and just as much as I would like to care for this thing outside of myself, I also need to care for myself too.
when I hear like I matter, it brings me to like the place where, you know, in my own work, it's like I have to remind myself I'm worthy, you know, and it's interesting working with clients, you know, in these spaces who maybe are disempowered, right? That worthiness word really kind of sticks. There's a defensiveness around that too, and I think what I've noticed is the first question is like, worthy of what? And it's like, no, you're worthy. Yeah,
Absolutely.
you find just kind of like when you're empowering clients and working with them to empower themselves that they have a hard time with some of those concepts like worthiness.
Yes, that's huge, right? You know, when you think about emotions like shame and guilt and the heaviness of them, that is what it is surrounded by, right? And it can be tempting to just sort of tell a client, you know, you're worthy, you know, can't you see you're worthy? But they can't receive it if their perspective is, in order to be worthy, I have to be this, or this has to look this certain way. So it ends up being a journey of seeing yourself and being able to be compassionate and loving and kind towards yourself to understand your worth, your worthiness, inherent worth.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said too for like the mind body connection around that kind of stuff too. And just the natural approach that you were talking about earlier that you take. It's like, I love all that stuff. Obviously, I mean, I'm a big dude covered in tattoos, not quite my approach in therapy, but it's always fascinating and funny to me because like, my best friend, he's a bit of a hipster, you know, and it's like, I may not look it, but my people are like, they're going to be frolicking in the flowers. You know, it's like, that was always my group of people. And it's interesting to sit with you and just kind of hear those very natural, like, in order to get to the roots of what I think in therapy we're all trying to get to with our clients, like shame and dissolving that, there's this process of just eloquently dancing and navigating around these defenses.
Yes, absolutely. Meeting the defense with love, actually, and compassion.
Yeah.
To hold the space, right? So when we think about why that's so hard, it's because a lot of times there was no model for what love looks like and compassion in a way that doesn't get taken advantage of.
Yeah.
Right? It's, if I'm loving or if I say I'm worthy, then that's a bad thing because XYZ.
Yeah.
But how can we sort of support the client in cultivating those attributes within the space? And sometimes it really is just about holding the space for them to explore it for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And I often sometimes think about like, you know, let's say like the random dude who rolls across this and they hear us having these conversations. It always cracks me up because, you know, I know a lot of men and I played sports my whole life and I know how they react to this kind of stuff. But there's a part of me sometimes that kind of wants to grab that concept of a guy and say like, this is actually so much more fundamental to like a life worth living that would allow you to be more masculinely yourself, or you know, if we looked at it on the mirror side, it's like to step more into your feminine energy, or if you got both, it's like this is how you live that balance. And it kind of cracks me up sometimes because you and I are having this conversation about the space, and I think there's a lot of people that need to hear that it's very practical in the way that you're sharing of like meeting a client where they're at and looking at the pieces of what's created this narrative for them.
Yes, exactly. Sort of their perspective. And to your point about the masculine feminine energy dynamic, right? It can be tempting to look at it as masculine male, feminine female, right? But we all have this yin yang dance, right? And the more we push one away, the more we lean into the toxic aspects of the other, right? So toxic femininity, toxic masculinity, right? We can over indulge in one. So it's, when you think about femininity or that sort of energy, it's it's providing the space for yourself, being a safe space for yourself, right? It's creative, it's being creative, it's flowing with certain situations, it's adapting, right? It's being receptive,
Yeah.
right? And then when you think about masculine, that's more structure, right? So
Yeah.
boundaries, or if you have a business, creating the organizational aspects of those things, whereas you bring in the feminine to flow into
Mm-hmm.
that business and create within the business,
Yeah.
right? So there's a dance for all of us between the two, and I think it can be easy to think, oh, this is masculine, this is feminine, but if you ever see a healthy balance of both, it's so
Mm-hmm.
beautiful, right, to
Yeah.
witness.
Yeah, you nail it, because it's precisely how I think of it's like feminine is just the nurturing energy, like the creative energy, the that guidance kind of energy, and then the masculine, at least, again, from my perspective, as you were stating, it's like those boundaries and the structure and kind of like that protection side. And I
Mm-hmm.
always, when I get men that are kind of like, well, I'm a masculine man, I'm like, dude, I have met so many women in my life who have way better boundaries than even me. And I've been a therapist for going on 12
Mm-hmm.
years. It's like
Mm-hmm.
they actually have quite a bit of that healthy masculine side of what they're, I think, in our society too, like craving to see,
Yeah, absolutely.
and that gets lost, I think, in the pop culture conversations too, when it becomes that
Yes.
debate about feminine and masculine. They're all missing the
Yeah.
mark. It's like,
Yeah.
this is
It's not that
within each of us
simple.
individually. That's why we
Mm-hmm.
know about the concepts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Exactly. And there's no, line to draw to say, oh, 50% here, 50% here.
Yeah.
Depending on the person, we each have, our own qualities, our own characteristics that can be, you know, um, feminine or masculine, but they're balanced in us for a reason so that we can show up in our most authentic, natural way.
Yeah.
And if we sort of reject any aspects of that, we can show up in a way that, doesn't support our ability to be well.
Mm. Yeah. And a lot of people right now reaching out in pain are unwell.
Mm-hmm.
So there's grace all around. It's I know that was true for me. If I look at when my journey started, it's like, yeah, I was unwell because I was out of balance, and
Mm-hmm.
not just like the masculine feminine concept, but some of the more like foundational components we're talking about too. If we put some words to it, it's like the lack of boundaries, the
Mm-hmm.
shame, the
Mm-hmm.
ways in which the distortions would come in. All
Yeah.
the points you're hitting on today. It's like
Mm-hmm.
these are often why clients reach out in distress.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And to your point, it doesn't always feel like it's a clinically significant issue. So some
Yeah.
clients may not even notice, right, what it is, but they feel
Mm.
like something's not quite right, or there's a little bit of out of balance. They're performing at work, people around them are not noticing, quote unquote, but they feel out of balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I would have eventually, I think, ended up in therapy, but it took a clinician that I really respected, and she noticed, she felt that I was off one day, and had been from time to time, and she came up to me and said, "Hey, look, I just thought I'd pull you aside and have a conversation with you." And if she hadn't have done that, I would have never met my therapist, who she checks in and watches this every now and then. So Sharon, I love you. Man, she has just come in and helped me navigate that, and to do the things you and I are talking about today. It's like you got to feel it.
Yeah.
I tell men especially this all the time, again, because you can speak much more to the female perspective, and I know there's plenty of females who come in our direction who are struggling with it too, but the men especially, because they get real logical, and it's like,
Yeah.
just for a moment, turn this off and feel
Mm-hmm.
it, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I think you're right in that an overwhelming majority of men, absolutely. And you see this in women as well, right? Especially when it comes to um, being in corporate environments
Mm.
sometimes, having to overthink things. Let's say you are in a family scenario and you're juggling all of the things and trying to sort of do it all yourself, right? that's where community comes in for anyone to
Yeah.
help you sort of share the load. But it can be easy to get into that over analytical space
Yeah.
and resist the urge to feel.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's why I like to focus on emotions a lot in
Yeah.
my work, because it can be intimidating to think about, okay, I'm going to feel this, but when you create the space that allows someone to notice how they feel and then from there sort of process those feelings in a way that feels safe and doesn't feel like, um, I've let out a can of worms and I can't put it back in.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of experience when there's a big disclosure, that's always the obvious one where you see like, oh, they realize they've let something out of the can,
Yeah.
and then normalizing that and the trust and feeling that too. But like I like what you were saying there too. It's like especially with new clients, creating the vocabulary around it is so
Yes.
helpful, because a lot of people, it's like I'll use certain, where I think because of what we do, it's like, oh, this is a pretty run-of-the-mill emotional term, and I have clients is like, I'd never looked at it that way or even ever used that word.
Yeah, yeah. And if you think about just society in general, sort of, it's been more, I think, supported to be emotionally numb
Yeah.
and to sort of not feel. The cool guy in the room doesn't look like he has any emotions, right?
Right.
But we're human beings, and emotions are energy in motion, right? So if we're not feeling it, it's getting stuck somewhere. So it's happening to impact our organs. It may impact us somatically. We may have stomach aches or headaches.
Yeah.
We may, feel really tired or exhausted all the time. And that is a telltale sign. Those physiological aspects are a telltale sign that the energy is not flowing through your body. So once you're able to feel your emotions and tap in and notice them, you can allow them to move freely, and you can sort of shake up that stagnation.
Yeah. And I think that whole concept you were just touching on, it's like normalizing that in the general conversations of your somatic experiences as they connect to your traumas and emotional experiences in life. I think there's, what I come across just like in my personal life, or if I ever talk to dudes from my past, it's still kind of viewed as like, oh, this is this like mystical, whimsical, woo-woo stuff. And the reality is like, we have plenty of research today that people are wandering into hospitals with unexplained medical diagnoses, and it's because their emotional distress that they never tended to were leading to a lack of flow, and their tendons and muscles and organs, I mean, they're getting dehydrated out of nowhere. It's like these freak things are happening, and it always has. We just know more about it today.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's the truth of it is so interesting, because we don't talk about it enough. We don't talk about the fact that just like a physical body, we have an energy body as well, right? And that energy body, we don't attune to it or pay attention to it, but our emotions tell us about what's happening there, right? These ailments that come up tell us what's happening there. Patterns that show up in our life tell us what's happening there. Patterns of relationship, or patterns of, noticing, let's say, your anxiety, for instance, showing up in certain situations, or depression sort of creeping up. All of these are an energetic component of our overall health.
Yeah. And it's fascinating, right? Like, society will have acceptance for certain diagnoses or terms, right? Like ADHD, anxiety, depression, and there's a bunch of big ones, bipolar, right? And then there's this pushback on mental health, like it's this mystical thing, and it's like, you were all just talking about anxiety, or depression. But as soon as we start talking about the underpinnings, you think we're wild and crazy and off the beaten path. It's like, well, hey, maybe you should come frolic with us for a little bit, because we seem to be at peace.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you slow down for a second, you might notice it too.
Yeah. Yeah, building that awareness. That's the slog.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the big piece.
Yeah. Not quite sure how the clinical world catches society up to that one, or if it ever would, but it's a fun thought to have.
I think it's getting there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of research related to sort of the physiological aspects of mental health.
Yeah.
And when I started looking at this recent modality, emotional transformation therapy,
Yeah.
that deals a lot with the somatic aspects, the way that our brains make connections based on our experiences, and how we can make shifts and changes, energetically,
Yeah.
through light, through eye movement, color.
Yeah. And that ETT, because I've heard this, right, and it's emerging, and there's from my understanding, right, you would have much more of an understanding of this. So this is more so me just trying to extract more information from you while I've got you. But there's a lot of heavy pieces of somatic therapies in there. There's a lot of pieces of maybe like traditional EMDR conversations around trauma and such. And maybe I'm off with some of those things, but there's a lot of
There's
convergence in
alignment.
this
Yes,
theory
yes.
that's emerging.
Absolutely. So just at the base level of it, when you think about neuroplasticity, our brain's ability to form new neural networks and connections, with trauma, what happens is there's a pathway that our brain goes down, and then it gets triggered to continue going down that pathway. So what can interrupt it, right? That's where all these modalities come in, from talk therapy to EMDR to CBT, right? You name it. But with ETT, it's, to me, amazing how quickly there can be transformative change simply because the light, the color, the eye movement forms a new pathway, right? Almost immediately. So it's almost like a new exit appears on a highway.
Sure.
And you're able to start going down that way, right? Whereas through a lot of like talk therapy, for instance, it's great, but the reason it takes so long is because there's a constant correction that has to happen. And typically, maybe someone is coming once per week. From 1 week to the next, that old pathway may already have, shown up again in many instances. So to correct it, you're doing it little by little, by little by little, until you get a new exit on the highway.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny as I'm listening to this analogy, I'm thinking like, with the 12 steppers I work with, I'm trying to get their car started.
Yeah.
But it's like once they do, it's this kind of stuff where it's like now we can start to explore with the foundation, because everybody comes into therapy, they want the solution, and a lot of that beginning is like, let's say I have someone who comes in who has severe trauma. It's like, unless that's substance use related, family history of alcoholism, kind of stuff, I'll typically refer out if it's like really severe trauma. But when they want to jump in right away, it's like let's get a foundation and stabilize you, and then I know someone really great who can walk you through with that approach, because like you were touching on that, it's like that's very my approach, just even in the way I was trained, is like I'm very much those little incremental changes, and that's my lane, it's my niche. I don't see myself changing in that, but I know, right, that there are these other alternatives that people really also would prefer, and it's just good to know they're out there.
Yeah. And it's great to slow things down in that way, because a lot of times trauma didn't necessarily happen overnight. Right? There were buildup of, yes, maybe a few incidents or one incident, but there are things that reinforce that neural network that creates the reality of this traumatic experience, and living in this space of there being something that impacts me that is really difficult for me not to react to.
That's why I liked it. You know, for those who maybe don't have our backgrounds who listen to this, and I know there's quite a few, even just from some of the other people who have shows on here will watch, you know, when I bring on other therapists, and you mentioning how therapy is that process of, you know, no matter what modality you use, of getting in there and kind of interrupting that process. I think that's something very tangible that somebody could take away with them of like, oh, that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just beautifully put.
Yeah.
I want to make sure, and let me just check here. Why don't we have, because I have a few questions for you before we kind of break here. Why don't we plug where those listening can find your website, you know, just any information that you would like to plug to them so that they could find you if they liked what you were talking about.
Sure. You can find me at Amaka Medart. So that's AMAKAMEDART.com. And you'll find all of the things I do there.
Yeah. And I'll have all of Amaka's information linked in the videos, whether you're seeing this on YouTube, check the description. If you're on Facebook, it'll be somewhere in the description there for Amaka Med Art and all of your social media links.
Yes, absolutely.
I have two very important questions for you before we wind up for today.
Okay.
If you were to open a mental health amusement park, what would be the first ride that you built and why?
Oh, that is a great question. The soothing soundscape.
Okay.
Because, you know, how great would it be to have an amusement park where you get on a ride and it just feels nice?
That would be
right?
nice.
There's sound, there's, you know, light, and you go through this experience and you feel like, after you get off.
That does sound nice. Almost like It's a Small World, but better.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. Who is your favorite childhood cartoon?
Ooh. Wow, I have to think about that one. My favorite. Okay, this maybe doesn't qualify, but I really like The Lion King, so Simba.
Okay.
From
Simba.
The Lion King.
Okay. How would Simba benefit from seeing you in therapy?
Oh, well, Simba went through a lot.
He did.
Right?
Quite a journey.
Exactly. And he had some generational trauma concerns as well, because he had an uncle
He had a messed up uncle, yeah.
Yeah, right. And he came from the perspective of, oh, we're family. I love my family. We're all loving. But he didn't know his uncle did not come from that perspective. So he got a kind of reality jolt, which actually took him outside of himself. It took him a while to come back to himself and understand, who he really is because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to have to go rewatch The Lion King and watch it from this framework.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Cool. Is there any last just kind of things you'd like to share with those who are listening? Any sign-offs or anything you'd like to share with our audience?
Sure. I guess one thing I'd like to say is not everyone can give you the love that they are unable to give themselves. So if you meet someone and you feel that there is tension or animosity, don't take it personally. It may be something that they're going through, a life experience that they have to sort of come to terms with. But what you can do for yourself is, if it's possible, remove yourself from that situation and, send them love, wish them healing, right? Maybe not literally say that, but do wish them well. It can be difficult for people to heal from things that have been difficult.
Yeah, very profound. Ladies and gentlemen, Amaka Agulué.
Almost Agulué.
Agulué. Yes. I told her, I said, I'm gonna get this eventually. So we're gonna have to have you back on the show too and dive more into, especially even these last profound just kind of nuggets that you were sharing with everybody. But thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Breaking the cycle, ladies and gentlemen. We break the cycle together every Friday, 7 p.m. Have a blessed night.